I bet if you asked your non-podcasting friends, all they think you do is record and publish. But by now, you've probably realized there's a bit more to it than that. I find this bit a piece of cake. The recording is the fun part. I enjoy the editing process and getting my podcast out into the world. But what I have found difficult was all the rest. The emails, social media, blog, all the other bits and pieces that help your content get seen and found by your ideal listeners. And then I got chatting to Emily Aborn, host of Content with Character, and She Built This. I asked Emily to come on to help us with repurposing our content so that it doesn't take a million brain cells and can be done reasonably quickly. You're going to hear a lot of suggestions, but don't worry about taking notes, as they will all be in my extended show notes. The link to that will be in the show notes. My name is Alison Fraser, host of Women Who Podcast, the show for side hustling women who are ambitious but time limited. Each week, I bring you real life stories and actionable tips to help you create and grow your own podcast. Let's get into it. Welcome on, Emily. You have 2 podcasts, which means that your time is probably a little bit more limited than most of us. So I'm really interested to hear how you repurpose your content so you get more from your podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, Allison. I'm really excited to be here. And I will say, when you say you have 2 podcasts, I do. And I also don't release both of them on the same frequency. So I just want listeners not to be like, oh my God, this person is doing all of the things. I started my She Built This podcast back in 2019, and it was like a week. It was a weekly show, and I would interview women entrepreneurs, and I did it day in and day out, and every single week released a new episode, sometimes bonus episodes, for 4.5 years. Last year, when I was deciding that I was going to start a new podcast, I had to make the decision that that's going to have to change. The consistency of that is going to have to change. And actually, I don't even want to say the consistency, the frequency needs to change. So instead of going on a weekly basis, I tapered back to every other week because I knew I was going to be putting a lot of my energy into the second show. And then from there, I tapered that back even more to once a month. So the real estate on that show is very limited as far as the guests I bring on, but also I don't want you thinking that I'm some Wonder Woman over here. That show takes me 2 hours a month, and then I'm set, So that's not a huge amount of my time, but I still love having the show for the repurposing piece, the collaboration piece, and also just feeding my own kind of curiosity. So that aside, my new show, or newish, it's actually coming up on a year now, is called Content with Character, and I focus on marketing and visibility, content creation, but really from a place of self-discovery. So I really want to help people figure out what makes them stand out, what makes them unique and different, and how they can set themselves apart in that way. And also get a little bit out of our own way as content creators, because I think we can all kind of do that, where we second guess ourselves, or we doubt something, or we worry about what every single person is going to think. So I started doing that. That is a weekly show. And that, I would say, is the one that I repurpose the most often. So when we talk through some of our ideas and examples, I'll use that. I might reference back to She Built This here and there, but that's kind of the lay of the land.
I'm curious to know. That's actually really interesting to hear that you've changed your frequency for She Built This to make sure that you could do both podcasts well. But I'm curious to know how long you had the idea for Content with Character before you launched it.
Oh, you're going to like this story, I think. So I have a friend who is a podcast producer, and I had hired her to do a podcast audit of the She Built This podcast. And basically, so I'm a copywriter, and I had this side business called She Built This, where I did events, and I had a membership, and it was a women's group. It was this whole entire thing. Okay. This whole separate entity from my copywriting business. And I was just really getting to a place where I wasn't able to give my copywriting clients all of my time and attention because I was so split. And so I was really this is the year I need to start leaning into that business and kind of closing off the other one. So I sat down with Alicia and I was like, help me make this podcast like about copywriting. Like, how can I turn this into a podcast about like my business? Right. And she was like, I mean, she said it in much more eloquent language and with numbers and stats and things like that. And she's like, you can't. Like, you have to start a new show. And I will tell you, when she said that to me, I looked at her, I was like, she's nuts. Like, I'm not starting a new podcast. I already have a podcast. It's successful. It's going. It's been going for 4.5 years. Why would I ever start a new one? So, whatever, the thought kind of goes out of my mind. Like, I don't even think anything of it. Well, one snowy day, and I was home by myself. My husband was on a trip, and I was left to like shovel like 40 inches of snow by myself. I mean, it was like a crazy, we had no power. Like, it was just like the time, everything was falling down on me. And I'm out there shoveling, and like all of a sudden, the name for the podcast, I mean, probably 100 ideas for the podcast pop into my head. Like, all of these things were just like, even shoveling, like I was thinking of content with character. I was like, this is building character, like just like it was kind of like this crazy moment. And so I came back to my friend. I was like, you know what? I think I'm starting a podcast. So that was how it happened. I realized that with She Built This, with the audience I had, with the way I'd like kind of gone, I wouldn't be able to really keep it that name and keep it in line with the mission I had for it without like drastically changing everything. And I didn't really want to do that. So that's kind of why I decided to start a complete separate thing, totally fresh with my own kind of expertise in it and not bringing in a whole bunch of other guests. So it's really just a solo show.
Solo show, but I guess you can bring all that you've learned previously from She Built This into your show. And I was going to say hit the ground running, but that's such a cliche. But knowing how a podcast works and knowing what your audience would like, you would already know how to do the episodes that are going to reach the people that you want.
It was such a good training ground. And I mean, it was a training ground and an actual thing, but I also bring in, She Built This. Like, now I can speaking of repurposing, I can say, oh, I just did this episode on She Built This that was about this. And I can also say, I just did this episode of Content with Character that was about this. So I can kind of like, cross over the two that way. And I love doing that. Like, even us doing this interview right now is a great example of how we can repurpose for one another. Like, now on my podcast, I can mention that I was on your podcast, right? And direct people to listen to that. So I think my favorite way to think of repurposing is thinking of it outside of the box. Like, it's not just like going through and like finding a quote from our chat or, finding a social media post in this blog post. It's so much bigger than that because it can kind of like make everything just like this cohesive package and flow together and just all make sense what you're doing.
Yeah. How long does it take though to repurpose stuff for like from your podcast for other things? I guess some things are quite simple, as you say, mentioning on your podcast, hey, I was on this podcast this week. That's seconds. But what about other things? I guess for me, I do my podcast, I get it published, I have the show notes, and I generally do a blog on my website. And then I'm just like all out of the, bandwidth headspace to try to do anything else because I do this, among other things as well. And by the time that's all done, it's like, oh God, I just want to read my book or watch TV.
So I think the goal of repurposing should be to save you time, save you energy, save you those creative wheels from spinning and trying to figure out what to do next. But let's take like a really big picture approach. So I know a lot of your listeners have like a side hustle, and it's kind of like this is their secondary thing. So, really, what they're doing in their podcast should be able to translate into anything else that they want to do to keep that side hustle kind of running. So, the way I like to big picture it or backpedal is I look at my podcast themes and also both podcast themes and also everything under that as kind of like a monthly focus. So I'll give you an example. In the month of February, my focus is collaboration and connection. So all I will be talking about all month long on that podcast is variations of collaboration and connection. Then I have, the 4 individual episodes that fall under those topics, and I use those for emails. I use those for social posts. I use those like to tie into whatever I'm promoting that month. So like collaboration clients is a huge person that we collaborate with, right? So I'll talk about like how working with me as a contractor is a collaboration, and I take a very collaborative approach. Like everything will kind of fall under those themes so that I feel like, oh, I don't need to reinvent the wheel. I don't need to think of something new. I already talked about it on this past week's episode. And then we'll go more granular, but really the goal of repurposing is twofold. One, save you time and energy. Two, help you go further faster, because so many people think like, oh, I already posted that. They already saw that. Or they listened to the podcast. They already heard that. But the reality is like people are A, not following us in all the places, and B, a lot of times they're going really, really fast and they don't catch something that you say the first time. So the more we can kind of like repeat the message, repurpose the message, say it in different ways, it's amazing how many times somebody will say to me like, oh my God, the way you said that just landed with me. And I'm like, I've literally said that like 30 times. Like that is something I repeat on a regular basis, but it just hits you sometimes, in a certain way on a certain day, depending on where you are as the listener, as the reader.
Tell me more about how you can take the one episode and the different things. So you mentioned how you put it into your newsletter and you're talking to people about those topics. How can you then get it all on, I know, Instagram, for example? Can you use the same content over and over on Instagram and do it in a slightly different way?
Yeah, let's break down like an episode, okay? So I like to start if you have the availability to have a transcript made either on Otter or on, I think, Descript. I think Audacity does one. It's super helpful to you as a podcaster if you don't script your episodes or outline your episodes really detailed. It's helpful to have a transcript because you can like kind of see all your little gems right there in front of your eyes. So that I do definitely recommend. I would not recommend taking that transcript and just like plunging it into ChatGPT and saying, write me a blog on this, or just taking that transcript and putting it up as a blog, right? Like we need to kind of doctor things up a little, change the call to action. Like the person reading it on your website is going to be different than the person listening to it. So what do I need to consider? So you take your transcript, and we'll just start with that. Like I love turning my transcript into taking the main points and making it a blog. So often with my show notes, if I do that, I'll even say I'll like have a link and say extended show notes, and then it'll click out to the blog. So somebody can, and I say that in my episodes, I'll be like, this one I don't want you to miss this. It has really detailed show notes. So you can find the extended show notes button in the show notes and click out and read the full blog. And because I don't want them over there, like sitting there jotting down notes. People have said to me, like, your podcast is like a masterclass. I need to take notes. I'm like, no, I don't want you to take notes. I want you to soak it in. I'll take the notes for you. So that's step one, is like we can just turn it into something big, like a blog. Step two, we talked about this before we hit record, but you can use it as a video. Like a lot of people are posting their podcast to YouTube. They're doing shorts or clips of their podcast and using that on social media. I know that's a big hit with people. I don't do that because I am very bad. I just got into Reels this year and I'm like, yay, me. I feel very proud of myself, but I'm not like a big video person. But video is a really, really easy way. And it's really easy for the person that doesn't want to do a blog, right? You can just simply take what you have on video and upload it. And if you use Descript, I think you can even edit the video to be like short and quippy and, make people say things that they didn't say. just kidding, but tighten it up. And then I also love, like I said, turning it into an email, which like I will just, if I share a story at the beginning of my episode, I likely will take, because I love to tell stories in my email. So I will likely just take the story from the beginning of the episode or another story that has to do with that story and then share that to my email list. Like that's the exact same piece that I use there. And then I will take that exact same story and use that on social media. likely on social media, you have to kind of clean it up, like shorten it up. But let's talk about like in an average episode, other things that you can share about the episode. So I'll use us as an example again. So behind every single podcast episode you do, for sure with a guest, but I would venture to say, like, even if it is a solo episode, there's a story behind the episode. Like, it's not like you and I just showed up here and we're like, oh, okay, we're on Zoom, we're recording, like we met in the podcast collaboration group, and there's a story behind that. There's what you were looking for, there's how I maybe made my post, there's connecting with other podcasters and the gift of connecting with other podcasters. There's the fact that you're living on Monday right now and I'm living on Sunday. Like there's stories behind every guest that we bring onto our show. So that's one post right there. Like, let's talk about the story of the episode. Number two, if you're doing a solo episode, I often like to tell like how I got the idea for this episode, like whether it was a client story or a book I read or whatever. If you're reading somebody's book that you're about to have on your show, you can actually like make a post that talks about reading the book, even before you have them. I love doing those. Like I'll be reading a book and I'll tease the conversation and be like, this book is so good, get this book, and then stay tuned because I'm having this author on my show on this week's episode. So that's another great idea to like, I've literally only got like a quarter of the way into my episode now, and I already have 4 ideas from that quarter of the way. You interrupt at any time.
Otherwise, I'm mentally taking notes. I'm mentally taking notes, and I'm going to go through my transcript and I'm going to like get bullet points for our listeners in the show notes, but also things that I can do myself. But you did mention video, and I kind of do video, but I kind of don't with Descript. And if any listeners who are using Descript for their podcast, you can create those audiograms. And they're really super simple to do. I've started to do them for pretty much every episode. So I guess I already am repurposing. I've created a template. So it takes me like 30 seconds to make an audiogram because I have the template. I just have to find the quote I want to use. And I copy and paste it into another file, bring up the template, and then I just have to change the name of the person and the name of their podcast to appear on the audiogram. And it's there.
See, you're doing it already. Yeah. And you're like, that's like 7 steps ahead of me. So, I just learned another little fun tip for people that are using Otter. I believe it's the second level up from the baseline, Otter. If you upload your transcript into Otter, you can ask Otter Chat so many fun questions to help you repurpose your episode. So one I did recently, I said, can you help me find a good title for this episode based on the main point of Lisa and my conversation? And it came up like I was sort of struggling to come up with a title, and the ones I was coming up with were not like, I was like, this doesn't feel right. And it came up with like the perfect title. And then I said, okay, can you create 3 to 5 ideas for social media posts from this episode? And it gave me just 3 bullet points that I could turn into social media posts. And so that is this is like what we should be using AI for, not to do the content for us, right? But to generate ideas for us. Cause like I can sit there, look at that transcript and be like, what should I share from this?
I'm going to have to check out Otter AI because I've used ChatGPT, and oh my gosh, wait, like you said, don't ask ChatGPT to write a blog from your transcript, because I did that just to see what it would do. And it was terrible. I thought
they're pretty bad.
I thought I know I'm going to have to spend some time to do it myself, but I know I can easily just turn this around so much quicker and in my voice also.
Sometimes I'll ask ChatGPT, like, how would you say this paragraph better? And what it gives me, I'm like, no, I said better, not way worse. So I'm with you. There are limitations, right? But you could, if somebody doesn't have Otter, they could, I think, use probably ChatGPT to do something similar. Like, can you give me the main points in this episode? Can you show me 3 ways I could turn this into something else? These are the kinds of things we should be asking it to do. Like, can you help me brainstorm how to creatively do this? Or you could just have me and Alison in your back pocket all the time, but that would be more expensive. So The other thing I love to pull from my episode, and I actually like to get a whole bunch, is a quote. And I'll tell you another super popular thing people are doing, and I also love doing this, is like a carousel. So recently I did one on the 6 types of procrastination. And so for my carousel, I just put on the top of each graphic one of the types of procrastination and then just talked about like this might be you if like it was super short and quippy, but it just lets them scroll through all 6 styles of procrastination before they even listen to the episode. And honestly, you could kind of get something from just those carousel posts. Like if you are the person that's never going to listen to my show, you're going to glean something from just going through that carousel. So quotes and then like any points you can break down in your episode into a carousel. Those are, I mean, it's trendy, but I also think that it's like awesome because you can like swipe through and read graphics of something that otherwise you would have had to listen to. And it also shows your listeners what they need to pay attention to when they're listening to the show. And it gives them a chance to reshare. You know, like if you come up with some of those real good quippy carousels, people want to reshare that stuff. So those are just those are kind of like graphical ideas. And then obviously the day of, you have, like you said, you repurpose kind of your show notes into like what the episode is actually about. I sometimes will do like a couple variations of my show notes. So I do like the show notes that went live, and then I do like my own little show notes, you know, like the more like wee, those kind of show notes. So I sort of have 2 ways to promote it. And I might change that depending on if I'm sharing to LinkedIn or if I'm sharing to my newsletter or if I'm sharing to Instagram or if I'm sending it to my guest to say, like, this is how you should share, you know, like it's going to sound a little different. And then the last thing, and you could do this in so many ways. You could do it with a carousel. You could do it with a short clip. You could do it with a reel. Is just like whatever the crux of the message is, like this big learning or takeaway, or even a micro one. Like sometimes at the beginning of my show, I'll say, here's just like a little tiny bonus lesson for you. And that whole entire bonus lesson, I will often repurpose into like a quick tip, you know? So those are just some ideas to get you started. I mean, we could keep on going, but the goal is to make it easier for you. And really, like, this is something I'm challenging myself to this year is, can I create just one piece of content every single week that I don't have to literally do anything else again because I'm repurposing it and slicing it out in different ways.
So many things that we could do, even just picking one. Just pick the easiest one and
Exactly.
start on that. Do you do these like straight after you've finished your episode? Like what's the timing for it so that it doesn't become this massive body of work?
Yeah. So I came up with a little process that works for me. And here's what I'll say about batching. Okay. Everybody is going to like to do it in a different way. So someone might like to sit down and record the whole episode, you know, do any editing or whatever that they need to, and then do all of the content right then and there. Upload it, you know, do all the show notes, everything, the graphics right then and there. So they might just like sit down, work on 1 or 2. I'm just going to episode and do it from start to finish. I like to record all of my episodes at once because you can see I'm a fast talker and I have like high energy when I'm speaking, but it's a little bit of a different energy when I'm writing. Like when I'm writing, I need like my peaceful piano music, you know, like my cup of tea, like everything needs to be quiet, no interruptions. So it's like totally, if I just task batch from start to finish, by the end of it, I'm going to be exhausted. So I will record a whole bunch of episodes, then I save them, and then I do all of the content for each episode, like on a weekly basis by itself. I might like do all the boring tasks, like upload it and stuff all at one time. But all of like the content creation tasks, I like to do at the beginning of the week when I'm touching, you know, when I'm like touching it, like I'm touching the content, I'm touching the episode. It's not just like, what am I saying again? What did I say in that episode? So I like to be close to it. And that's why I do it that way. And again, it works different for everybody. I have a friend who sits down at the beginning of every month and she writes 31 social media posts and then she's done and she never has to look at it again. And it's amazing. And I've sat and watched her do it. And I'm like, that is awesome.
Yeah. But we are all different, aren't we? And so that works for your friend to do 31 in a row, and for you, one episode at a time, nice, quiet thinking space. I think I'd probably be the same. I need to have that focus on the work that I'm doing in hand.
And if you keep, the thing I love is like if I do tie it all in as a theme, I often can just like, I know that I'm in the same track when I'm writing all my stuff. And so that helps too, I think. Like
Mm.
if I was talking about something completely different every single week, which I used to do when She Built This, that can get a little hard.
Yeah. So I can see how themes will also be quite helpful. So listeners, if you do themes, then that's going to be very beneficial to you. And maybe I could be thinking with some themes too. I did do a theme, I think the end of December, started January, it was thinking about wellness and all that. But I kind of got sidetracked with other people that I could have on.
And that happens, and that's okay. I mean, none of this is so stringent that we have to like hold ourselves to it. So with the themes, I always love people. I've heard, an objection on that is someone's like, that's silly or stupid, or I don't want people to know I'm doing that. You don't have to actually even announce it. You can have it be as wide and spacious as you want, or as narrow and focused as you want. And you never even have to announce that it's your theme. I like to tell my listeners what they're going to get from me at the beginning of the month. And I like to remind them what they got from me or what they can go back and listen to. So that's just my own personal thing. Like I'm constantly repeating myself. And so that's why I announce my theme, but you don't have to announce your theme.
And the best thing is that you can always change. If you don't have themes, you can start introducing them. And if you've been doing themes and it's not working for you anymore, then it doesn't really matter, does it?
Yeah. Yeah. And also another example of a theme is just like, what do you want to promote and focus on in your business right now? Or what niche do you want to focus on right now? So that can itself develop a theme for you. So, like, let's say in the month of March, you're trying to get strategy calls. That's all you're focusing on. You can just make your theme have to do with strategy calls. So,
That's another great tip. I was going to ask you next, Emily, about what you've learned through podcasting from 2019 onwards. What would you share with beginner podcasters that you've learned yourself?
oh, I've learned so much. Okay. I would say I have learned to grow in myself and get confidence in myself and also get really clear and like honed in on my message. So I used to be kind of all over the place and like not know how to talk about myself, not know how to describe what I do. And I think that rippled out. Like other people were like, I don't really know what she can do, but she can probably help you. So, you have to think of the listener. Like if I'm confused, they're definitely confused. So I think it's really helped me to find that voice and find that message and like hone in on it. I've met so many new friends podcasting, like some of my best friends I've met podcasting. Some of my best friends I've met when I very first started my She Built This podcast. Like it's kind of crazy what happens when you start podcasting. The podcast community is awesome. And then I've also learned, and I think this is really important, is like just don't be afraid to ask somebody. Like, even if you think they're way out of touch, way out of reach, like I've had some really big names on my show that I just reach out to and I'm like, hey, do you want to be on my podcast? And maybe they even tell me no at first, but I go back and reach out to them again. And then it always surprises me. I'm like, oh my God. Like, I don't know if you guys know this person in New Zealand, but Farnoosh Charabi is like a big money person here in the United States. Like, she's very, very well known. And she said yes to being on my show. And I've had like all kinds of people in that same vein where I'm like, I'm just glad I asked. Like, it was scary to ask, it's scary to get rejected, but just don't let that stop you and keep on asking.
That's a very good tip. And what's the worst that can happen if they say no?
No harm.
Yeah.
In fact, I will say the big names, the more famous or well-known guests, they are less likely to share your episode than, just like your everyday person. Like you can guarantee I'm going to share your episode because we're like the girl next door. But when somebody is more well-known and more famous, they're actually less likely to share our episodes because they don't need to share our episodes, right? They're like out there writing books and have a podcast of their own. They're all set. So just keep that in mind. When you get a no, it's just a yes for another guest that is gonna be a good collaboration for you and share your episode.
That's a very good reframe. I love that. So do you listen to, or I guess you must listen to lots of podcasts yourself, being a podcaster, that's kind of how we entertain ourselves. But can you share a couple of your favorites right now?
Sure. I listen to like all kinds of random podcasts. I have a lot that I like, but I'll share two. One, which I recently found, is called Friend Forward. And it's basically about women friendships and like how to have quality women friendships, both in entrepreneurship and outside. Because I don't know if you guys have this problem there in New Zealand, but like we have a hard time making friends once you get past like 35 in our country. Like it's really hard, especially I don't have kids. And so it's really hard to find female friends. And so this podcast is totally all about that. And actually, I'm having Danielle Jackson, the host, on my show because I want to talk specifically about friendships as women entrepreneurs. And like that's a whole nother beast in and of itself. So that's one of my favorite. And what I also love about it is you can go through her episodes and she titles them in such a way where it's really easy to know what she's talking about. So if it doesn't relate to you, you can just skip it, or if it's like, oh my God, I just had a friend breakup, download. I need to apologize to somebody, download. So it's like really, really, it's just like stuff that you actually need on a regular basis with your friendships. The other one I love this is again not business related, but I think any self growth and self development is helpful for our business. So the other one is called Modern Wisdom by Chris Williamson. And I just find he takes, topics that everybody's talking about on mainstream podcasts and breaks them down in different ways. And I really love it. So he has some great guests on his show and all about like positivity and just doing the best thing we can for ourselves.
They both sound really awesome. And I will have the links in the show notes in case anyone's listening along and wants to check those out. And yeah, Daniel Jackson's podcast sounds very, very cool, especially, I mean, I'm in my 40s, but I can identify with that too.
Yeah, it's not easy, especially finding people that are like have the same interests.
Yeah.
And
Well,
let me just put a pin on this. The fact that you asked me that question is another great example of how we could repurpose this episode. Like we could say, I could say, you asked me this question. Here's two podcasts I'm listening to right now. And vice versa. You could say, my guest Emily just shared these two podcast episodes with me, or podcasters. Here's the podcast. So like every question we ask our guests can often be repurposed into something else.
and the funny thing is, as you were saying that, I already had that in my head. It's like, I'm going to repurpose this.
See, you're learning already.
Yeah. I've learned so much from chatting with you, Emily, and I'm sure our listeners have too. But where can we find you for more of your gold?
Well, thank you, Alison. And again, thank you so much for having me. I've really, really enjoyed this. Since everybody's already listening to your podcast, it's an easy jump over to mine, which is Content with Character. If you're not interested in listening to my podcast, but you want to connect on Instagram or something like that, my website is emilyaborn.com. It's like acorn with a B, and everything, all my social stuff is on there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you, Alison. This was fun.
Are you feeling less overwhelmed at what you could be doing? Speaking with Emily was not only fun, but I felt so seen and supported. In fact, I felt so energized that I sent out an email to my list for the first time in 2 months and crafted another one to go out a few days later. You can find all her suggestions in the extended show notes, and you may remember her mentioning that she does these. Well, I took a leaf out of her book. They're on my website, and the link to those is in the show notes. I'd love to hear your takeaways on this, so please let me know what resonated with you most. My show notes are now open to other podcasters, so if you want your name and podcast mentioned, you can get featured by joining my Patreon. It's just $5 a month. Thanks for listening. That's it from me this week, and I'll speak to you again soon.